Cronos: The New Dawn is a very intriguing new intellectual property from Bloober, the makers of The Medium, and much more recently, the Silent Hill 2 remake for Konami, and in many ways it shares a lot of similarities with that latter game. It is wonderfully atmospheric, with some great music and gameplay design, but it does have technical issues that will get in the way of immersion even on an ultra high-end PC. In today's technical review, I will talk a bit about the game and how it plays, go over the things it does well and does poorly, and I will give you some insight into performance on lower end components. I've got a lot to say here, so let's get right into it. Now, the basic elevator pitch for this game probably sounded like this. Dead Space and Resident Evil meet in a Returnal themed bar, and they order Polish vodka. That sounds a bit too much perhaps on the face of it, but in practice, in-game, it works out really well due to how reserved and understated the game can be. The game gives you very little of its backstory in its intro beyond you just being the traveler. But as soon as you step out of your entry vessel, you immediately get a sense of how the game will play, right away. It will be slow-paced, it will be brooding, it will explain the story of its world and your character through the environmental storytelling, and not through directed cutscenes usually. You will find yourself in a hub-like environment at times, traversing back and forth to unlock the next area while scavenging for scant resources. And the combat, when it does hit, will be very fast and quickly fatal. A few false steps and you are dead. The combat in the game is very high tension and plays out differently than that typically found in the genre due to its two main gameplay characteristics. 1. Your guns can shoot in a semi-automatic fashion, but they will be weaker and you will waste the very limited ammo that you have access to. For them to be effective, each shot should be charged, which takes time. But time is not on your side, as 2, the longer your enemies are in a room with one another, the more powerful they become due to melding. The enemies in this game basically stand over falling corpses and tentacle bind with them, powering the enemy up. So you have to dispatch enemies quickly and not daddle around too long. Otherwise, the enemies become too powerful to dispatch, or if you have the power to dispatch them, you will be draining your very few resources completely. This makes combat very desperate when it does start, as you need to be quick on your feet and use environmental help, line of sight blocking, or utilize the game's burning mechanic to deny corpses to the monsters. I won't spoil too much here, but I really love playing the game, both in its hectic moments and in its more common cerebral moments of exploration. If you like Dead Space, Returnal, or Resident Evil 4 and want to see a different take on it, well, this game is definitely for you. So the gameplay and ambiance here are very well done. And now we have to come to the technical portion of the game, and things here are more mixed. If you've played Silent Hill 2 on PC, there is much familiar here that is both good and bad. The good, you have shader compilation, which appears to be rather complete and useful. The game does offer hardware lumen as an option to increase fidelity at a cost. You have access to scalers and frame gen in the same settings menu that Silent Hill 2 has, so you can scale downward to increase performance. The game also, in general, looks excellent, which I think is plainly obvious in the footage I've shown so far. Bloober do use all of the UE5 headline graphical features here, including tight animations that are very satisfying. Artistically too, I'm very pleased to see a setting and time period not often shown in games, the architecture and kitsch of real existing socialism as it was in Poland. Bloober nailed this aspect. The good stuff though can at times be outweighed by the bad. The graphical options I mentioned earlier, being the same as Silent Hill 2's, will give you granularity to scale down, but scaling up has diminishing returns for quality and performance, even with hardware lumen in play. So the art is great, but some UE5 issues rear their head due to a lack of upward scaling. Lumen is struggling in this game at times primarily due to small emissive light surfaces, such as the little emissive texture on your flashlight in the game. That thing causes a lot of splotchy lighting instability in shadowed areas, and it's always following your character around, so it's there throughout the entire experience. Lumen is honestly bad with emissives, and this is an area where I would recommend the devs to cull that flashlight emissive from the lumen scene to decrease overall lumen noise. Virtual shadow maps also in this game are not holding up too well, being grainy in appearance and prone to aliasing, I would say. They are definitely not ray traced quality, that is for sure. And lastly, there are a couple of environmental details that could use another pass of artist love, like these blinds and curtains. The curtains animate at 20 FPS and the blinds move at 30 FPS and look awkward. The diminishing returns aspect is definitely felt in the high-end GPU performance, and to give you a sense, I originally started the game at 4K DLSS quality mode with no frame gen and an RTX 5090 using hardware Lumen, and it was immediately apparent that this game was very heavy on the GPU. The opening cutscene was in the 40s. Dropping to DLSS performance mode saw it running at 60 thankfully, but as I played through the game, even that was technically not enough in all situations. For example, there are these monster spawning effects that can occur which can have a GPU hammering moment when the settings are maxed, dipping the 5090 here into the 40s when it occurs. This can happen in any of the more overgrown effects heavy fights where the monsters are spawning. When you think about it, this is 4K DLSS 3 performance mode on an RTX 5090, and DLSS 3 is super cheap on that GPU, sub half a millisecond at this res. So the bulk of the rendering pressure is coming from things rendering at 1080p, and this GPU is just not enough to maintain 60 without frame generation. This is quite a lot heavier than every path tracing game released to date, in spite of all the rendering faults I talked about earlier regarding lumen and shadow presentation. I do think it is a good looking game, don't get me wrong, but the visual quality is not exactly lining up with the demands on the GPU when you use higher settings. Another aspect that is familiar to those who played Silent Hill 2 are traversal stutters. Cronos has them to a lesser degree. Basically, when walking across the environment, there are moments when you cross invisible lines, and these trigger some sudden, larger, single-threaded CPU burden, and when it happens, the frame time spikes up. As we can see here on a Ryzen 5 3600, these are commonly found even in the game's smaller environments, just when going from area to area, and in the moment, they cause the animation to seize up and look visually choppy. There are, of course, a few issues with this. In an immersive game like this, it will take you out of the experience when they happen if you're a person like me. Another issue is that hardware Lumen induces more stuttering in this game. The traversal stutters are a tiny bit longer, but most importantly, the shader precompilation step in this game only seems to cover the software path playthrough. So if you play the game with hardware Lumen on, you will be seeing shader compilation stutters that are just not there if you had left on software mode. That is something the devs definitely need to fix and make sure that their precompilation step also covers a hardware path playthrough of the game, because at the moment it doesn't appear to. Another issue is that the traversal stutters that do occur in the game will be found on all CPUs out there, even the 9800X3D. And lastly, even if you implement a frame rate cap, you will still see stutter occurring in animations due to delta time issues I detailed extensively in my Silent Hill 2 PC review. This appears to be an Unreal Engine issue of some sort, but even if you lock the frame rate as we see here and have a steady frame timeline, the camera and character animations stop and start again when crossing invisible boundaries in the game world, and these are found throughout every area you go in. If you unlock the frame rate in that area, you would see that boundary line animation stutter coincides with a repeatable frame time spike. Now, this is in essence the same problem I talked about in my Silent 2 PC video, although I would argue here it is somewhat less distracting in general due to frequency. Though it is still distracting overall, and I would do anything to not have it be in this game. But there is nothing really the user can do that is reasonable. It is hard to completely fault Bloober here in 2025, as fixing the issue basically required custom low-level work, which only the extremely large engineering-laden studio that is CDPR could muster. And even then, their experimental fast geometry plugin has only just recently been released. Either way, your mileage will vary about how distracting you find it. but on my subjective level, I found it distracting, but it was at least better than in Silent Hill 2, and at least nowhere near as bad as it is in the Dead Space remake on PC, for example. In the end, this is a CPU issue, and as I mentioned earlier, the only way to make them a bit smaller is by turning off hardware lumen, and that is really about it. Ignoring that issue though, for the meantime, your next priority here in this game will be upping GPU performance on low-end kit because, as I mentioned earlier, if you max out the game, it is very heavy even on the best GPU out there. Loading up the game on an RTX 4060 paired with a Ryzen 5 3600, we find ourselves heavily GPU limited at 1080p native TSR using the game's maxed settings, much like we really expected it to be. Barely anything happening, and we're in the 40s, 30s, and even 20s in the heaviest section around the biomass areas, which appears to be the heavier areas in the game based upon the RTX 5090 experience. So optimized settings are definitely a must. The first port of call is hardware lumen. Yes, you get less noise, and yes, you get more accurate reflections as we can see in the broken glass here, but the cost is huge. 70% performance increase by going down to software lumen here, which I definitely recommend with a GPU of this caliber, and honestly almost any GPU other than the biggest ones out there. After going down to software lumen, you should adjust shadow quality. Now, at first, it's easy to think this setting is free performance. Like here in this scene, looking at the shadow quality, they essentially look all the same between the presets, with medium running 11% better and low running 23% better. You would think low would be the great choice, but this setting doesn't appear to affect VSM quality, rather the quality of volumetric lighting. Looking at that, we can see minimal degradation with medium, but massive degradation with low. This setting ought to be labeled differently, I would say, but other than that, use medium for optimized settings. Then you have shading quality as your last instance to optimize. Here this setting is subtle. Side by side, you should be struggling to understand why medium runs nearly 30% better in this biomass area. It is indeed hard to see in direct lighting. Moving the camera to the indirectly lit area shows a minor difference. There are less reflections on the sinew here. That is because this setting appears to affect the roughness cutoff of lumen reflections, where it falls back to a lesser approximation. If you look directly at more reflective surfaces, like in the mirror here, you can see how the window stops reflecting in at the medium setting, where it is there in the high setting. For mid to low spec GPU, medium here is the obvious optimized setting, given the game's grittier art direction, which has few polished surfaces. In total, in a heavier area, optimized settings can improve performance on the RTX 4060 at 1080p native TSR by 113%, taking it from a 30 FPS or lower experience to one with 60 FPS and far less variability. My last recommendation is to use upscaling. Instead of native 1080p, go for something like 1440p balance mode, DLSS, as we can see here on the far left, which will run a little bit better than the TSR one and be clearer and more detailed due to ML reconstruction at a higher output res. With these settings, most GPUs will be enjoying a greatly GPU limited experience, with only heavier cutscene moments requiring the usage of VRR. The last optimization I have is for 8GB GPUs. Much like in Hellblade 2, 8GB GPUs need to use the low texture setting here. This setting doesn't really affect typical texture resolution, rather it affects streaming budget and texture flip time. If it is on anything higher than low, it can lead to situations like this here, where if you cross streaming boundaries, performance can plummet momentarily and then return to normal. So definitely use low textures on an 8GB GPU to avoid this situation. And with that being said, I'm at the end of my video here. Cronos is a good game, and it is very pretty, but it can be let down by the traversal stutters that are all too common in Unreal Engine 5 games. The delta time animation issue is also an issue for sure, but once again, that is a deep-seated UE5 issue apparently. It is a shame how these typical issues are letting the experience down, and they are distracting when they pop up, but if you do like this type of game a lot, this is a hard to miss experience. Anyway, like, subscribe, help us out on Patreon, and as always, this is Alex, bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen!